Hello everyone, welcome to my Callisto protocol, maximum security difficulty, no upgrades walkthrough. This will cover the part where we get the suit, all the way to the part where we fight Ferris for the first time. And this is the point in the game where I really feel like the game diminishes a lot in quality, because the sequences, a lot of the times they drag out, a lot of the times they feel very confused with their mentalities, and a lot of the poor designs really show themselves. The story just doesn't go anywhere. There are so many walking moments where you're just walking around with Danny getting into exposition that is not even that important. And it just leads to a very shallow, boring experience. And, there were some sequences that I originally liked in my blind playthrough, but now I don't like them as much anymore. And also, for some reason, when you start this part of the game, the enemies, they now have the ability to chain their grab into their combos, which is such fucking bullshit, because as I've already explained, the grabs on this game are completely unfair, and they're the worst grab animations ever made in a game, because they completely defeat the whole purpose of the melee and the dodge system. The enemies can just pull out that grab anytime they want. You have no chance of moving, you have no chance of dodging, you don't have the reflexes to dodge any of that. How is that fair? How is that good? And the only possible way you are going to circumvent this issue is to play with auto QTE on. But when the game experience isn't tarnished when you're playing with auto QTE on, why the fuck would the developers waste time with QTEs? When it's going to lead to a fundamental error in the game's programming, and it's going to lead to so many broken moments. It's practically an unfinished product if you're going to be designing the grabs and the QuickTime events as such. It's such bullshit. I really don't understand how this is the case. Like, in Dead Space 1, in Dead Space 2, and sometimes in Dead Space 3, although I felt it was a lot more bullshit in Dead Space 3, but in general with Dead Space, you don't have the enemies just instantly grab you out of nowhere. They have to do a very specific animation that you're supposed to understand and then respond to it accordingly. And in Dead Space 1 and 2, you could at least make the enemies flinch, but Dead Space 3, because of the fact that the enemies didn't flinch whatsoever, it could be very bullshit. And whenever Necromorphs ran at you in that game, whenever they started an attack animation, you had no chance of interrupting it, because that was just EA's way of forcing you to slot into the microtransaction system, or to just slot into the upgrades like crazy, and it was so retarded in Dead Space 3. But you don't see any moments in Dead Space where the enemies just instantly grab you out of nowhere, and you have no chance of avoiding it. Why is this the case with this game? It's so dumb. Same with this section right here. This right here is one of the most confused sections ever in the Callisto protocol. This is a sequence that plays out like a time sequence, because you have this officer who's saying you have to find something in the area before those things come back, but the enemies do appear. And it plays like a kill-based sequence. You have to kill a certain number of enemies in order for the sequence to progress. I think you have to kill at least 5 or 6 enemies in order for the enemies to spawn behind those doors, and then when you get near the doors, the enemies will break through the doors, and this is what will allow you to gain access to the key card and the way out of here. But it doesn't communicate it properly that this is a kill-based sequence. It's the same with New Capcom when they designed Resident Evil Village's intro with the Lycans. That whole village siege moment in Resident Evil Village is one of the most confused sections ever, especially on our first playthrough. You don't know that the sequence is a time-based sequence. You assume it's a kill-based sequence because you're so used to Resident Evil 4, which is what the game is taking influences from, and it does it very poorly in every single way when it comes to taking influences from Resident Evil 4. But you're assuming that it must be a kill-based sequence, and you're not thinking to just wait behind a barricade and time the sequence out, anything like that. But when you look at the way the combat is, when you look at how much life the enemies have, when you look at the lack of flinch animations, it doesn't feel like a sequence befitting for killing. Yet, you go around the arena, there is no way to escape, every single entranceway is blocked down, and you can't get through them, so you probably think it's a time-based sequence, but when you're probably staying on ladders, the timer doesn't count down, and so the sequence is just not ending, and like the music then picks up and Uria spawns in, and it's still very confusing. And that was what my first playthrough of Resident Evil Village was like, and I had to restart the entire game again so that I'm able to prematurely approach the section correctly because New Capcom was too incompetent to actually convey how the sequence ends, and it's so retarded. And I feel like they've one-upped New Capcom in that department because there are a lot more sequences like that in this game, where there are sequences that look like they're time sequences at face value, but they're actually kill-based sequences. And this one I feel is the worst, especially with the way the scripting works with the enemy spawns. I don't know how the enemies spawn in, but I feel like it's in relation to where Jacob is on the map, or maybe it's based on like a certain time limit. Like, I don't know how the spawns work. It feels like at times the spawns have scripting errors to them. And also, there are enemies inside of the snow, like they're just hiding underneath the snow. And sometimes when you go near them, they don't spawn, but then other times they will spawn, and it's so inconsistent. And so that area I was in when I was dealing with the rushers, that's the best area where you want to stand, because you're not dealing with enemies just hiding underneath the snow right there. And also, I've just done the sequence, so as you see right there, that enemy just spawned, and he opened the door, so I'm able to grab the core that this guy has, which is what I was referring to as a key card, which was a mistake. And now I'm able to get to this side and use the core in order to gain access to the door. But there are still a couple of enemies in the way. This place is also littered with explosive canisters, and I don't know why I didn't use the grip right there. I think that was because my grip is low on energy, and I thought he would just drop it, but you'd be amazed at how little the energy meter decreases when you're picking up items. When you're picking up enemies, the meter will decrease a lot. It will decrease even more if you're picking up the larger enemies, so you never want to use the grip on rushers because they are the largest enemy you'll be dealing with. You can use it against spitters and other enemy types, but just don't use it against the rushers. There really isn't a point, aside from the habitat sequence when you're at the dome and you're just tapping the grip button in order to knock those rushers off the trees in order to kill them. And that is the most effective way to approach that sequence. And now we have this. So this sequence I did like in my blind playthrough because I do like the claustrophobic corridors, the darker atmosphere, and the shadows at play, and there's the lighting. I think it makes for a pretty intimidating sequence, but when you're going through it again, it does lose some of its luster. And also, right here, this is a very strange placement of an exploder. So that right there is a new enemy type. So we're being introduced to exploders. They're just called that. They're not called anything special, like in Dead Space 1 or Dead Space 2, which is disappointing for an enemy name. And these exploders appear in the same locations, and when you shoot them, they will detonate. If they get near you, they will charge up to detonate, so you got to get away. The blast radius on these exploders is way wider than you're expecting. Yet despite this, the exploders are so underpowered compared to the bombers and the crawlers from Dead Space 1 and 2. Like, every time those enemies detonated near other enemies, they would always kill them. But the exploders are so underpowered in this game, they will just knock over your most basic enemy type, and it's so stupid. And it really diminishes their value as an enemy type when they're not even that damaging against the other enemies. I don't even know if the exploders can kill you instantly at the HP that I'm at. And can you even upgrade your HP in this game? I don't think you can. I think in Dead Space 1, 2, and 3 you can upgrade your HP, but I don't think you can upgrade your HP in this game. I could be wrong. I mean, this game doesn't have any kind of armor system like Dead Space 1, 2, and 3. Like, you're stuck with the same exact suit, aside from a couple of cosmetic changes based on DLC, which I'm honestly amazed that they didn't bring in more suits with this game, because the suits were a trademark component to a lot of the Dead Space games, if you're that kind of person that likes to invest in the suits. I don't invest in the suits whatsoever. It's a waste of time, even if they do provide additional inventory space. But given how much Dead Space 1 and 2 can be done with just the plasma cutter, there really isn't a need to manage any inventory space. Well, also, this sequence right here, this is a really fun sequence. I do like this part. So, the enemies are going to spawn from the same locations. There are spikes around the area, and I'm going to use this crate to my advantage, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to lure the enemies up onto the crate, and then when they drop down, I'm going to hit them into the spikes. Or what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to just use the grip right here, because as long as you use the grip as fast as possible, you won't drain as much energy. I originally thought that when you use the launch feature on the grip, it would drain even more energy, but Ether has mentioned that it doesn't drain your energy any faster if you use the launch function of the grip. So I'll take Ether's word for it, but I just really felt like in my initial playthroughs I was draining more energy when I was using the launch feature. And that's why you see me just grabbing enemies and then dropping them off a ledge, not really using the launch function, because at the time I really thought the launch function would drain more energy, but it doesn't actually. And there we go. That enemy is dead. He didn't get the chance to mutate, which was nice. And there should be 1 or 2 enemies left. Yeah, there's a spitter right there. So I'm just going to lure him over to the spikes and just melee him. And I still find it very strange. You can grip the enemies and launch them into spikes and they will die. You can melee the enemies into the spikes and they'll die. Yet, when you use the riot gun against the enemies, and the riot gun is a huge knockback against the enemies, like you can actually knock them back a lot. You can't knock them into the spikes with the riot gun. It's so stupid. And you do get the riot gun after that sequence. So what you want to be doing is you want to be investing less into the hand cannon and more into the riot gun. So what I'm going to do for this walkthrough is I'm going to be mainly selling my hand cannon ammo and just buying nothing but riot gun ammo. And I definitely recommend you buy the upgrade that gives the riot gun an increased clip capacity, because I cannot tell you how annoying it is having to use only 4 shells and then having to reload all the shells as slow as possible, and this gives the enemies so much time to attack you. You're dodging them, and it's just wasting more time in preventing you from reloading. And the extended mag attachment for the riot gun, it will allow you to instantly reload your riot gun, which is really helpful, and you get 8 shots. And I highly recommend you have this for the final boss fight. And I need to make an update with the final boss fight. So I mentioned in part 1 of this walkthrough that I did not want to do no damage against the final boss because it's a really shit final boss and it's so badly designed. But after the patch 1.08, I fought the final boss again, and I was able to stay close to the final boss the entire time and just bait out his 1 melee attack, because he only has 2 attacks. He has the 1 melee attack, which you can just dodge, and then the acid attacks. And Ether mentioned that depending on what arm the boss uses when he's using his acid attack, you need to run to the correct side in order to avoid it. But I mean, the main problem is at times he can do the acid attack at a pretty close range if you're ever so slightly off from being close to the final boss. And that's the main problem with that attack, and that's what can make it bullshit. If you're relatively close to the final boss and he does that move, and it doesn't do a lot of damage, and when you're blocking it, it does very minuscule damage, but it's still annoying nonetheless. But anyway, returning back to this tangent, I was able to do the final boss no damage by basically staying near him the entire time and just baiting out his melee attack. I mean, the exploders were the trickiest part of the final boss fight, because a lot of the times I would be trying to shoot them and the boss's body would get in the way, or I would be trying to grip onto the exploders and Jacob would prioritize another object. And that has always been a problem in a lot of Visceral games. Like, when you're trying to use Kinesis in Dead Space 1, 2, and 3, the main issue with Kinesis is the character has a tendency to grab onto the wrong object because the detection is so sensitive to other objects in the area that when you're trying to, say, for instance, grab onto a Necromorph spike to use it against the other enemies, he ends up prioritizing like a barrel, for instance, and it's so frustrating in Dead Space 1, 2, and 3. And in the Callisto Protocol, this is still a problem, but I don't think it's to the same degree as with Dead Space 1, 2, and 3, because they don't litter as many objects throughout the combat environments when you're dealing with the enemies. And personally, I've never understood why they give you the ability to grab onto multiple different objects. Like, let us grab onto the Necromorph spikes and the explosive barrels, but ignore everything else. Like, there's no purpose to picking up these other objects that are so useless. All they do is just knock over Necromorphs, but you already have the stun systems provided by your weapons, serving as a good substitute in Dead Space 1 and 2. Even the melee system is reliable for that. But, like, why would anyone choose to use Kinesis on a barrel, a box, or a container and launch it at Necromorphs when it doesn't do anything? and you're far better off just using your weapons or your melee just to deal with the enemies. Like even like in Dead Space 3, there was no reason to even have that because of course the enemies didn't flinch whatsoever in Dead Space 3, and it was so garbage. Like, they should not give you the ability to grab onto multiple different objects. Let us only grab onto the more important objects that actually serve a purpose in the combat. Because as it stands, all that is doing is just getting in the way of the gameplay, and it's proven to be very frustrating when you're trying to use Kinesis, or when you're trying to use the GRP, and your character just grabs the wrong object. It's really frustrating. Oh, and also right here, we're being introduced to a new enemy type, which I don't know if you can really consider this to be a new enemy type. It's just a blind enemy. It's basically a normal enemy type, similar to a spitter, that is just blind. But the good thing is, you have the ability to do stealth kills against this enemy, and it's very reliable, and there's so many of them. And I like the idea that they put in so many of this enemy type in these environments because it's the game's way of making you use stealth, but it doesn't use a really stupid reason for why you're only allowed to use stealth. It actually gives a logical reason to actually make you do stealth, while at the same time making the stealth very, very powerful. And, you know, like, the game doesn't really encourage stealth that often, so to actually get this change of pace is nice, and I think it really allows the darker environments to stand out a lot more. It really captures the intimidation factor to these environments. Well, and also, you'll want to grab this red barrel at a distance, because if you go on this spot of the platform, that bloodworm will catch you at a distance. It's really stupid. Like I said, that enemy type has way too much range. So, also, I think if you use the red barrel on that bloodworm, the enemies will not be alerted to your presence. I think if you use your bullets to destroy the bloodworm, the enemies will know where you are, which can be problematic. But I'm just going to sneak past these enemies. And another good thing about putting in this many enemies is that you're going to be able to replenish your loot. You're going to be able to replenish your credits, your ammunition, your health injectors, and it's needed because the rest of this game can become very unbalanced, and like a lot of enemies just have so much life. And I mentioned in part 1 that I'd be talking about the boss you encounter, which is the split head fight. They use that enemy type way too much. So, like, starting from the rail sequence, where you're doing that sequence reminiscent to Dead Space 2's drill sequence, you'll be fighting this giant split head enemy 4 times, and I mean it, 4 times, and they don't even space out these enemies in a way that makes you go, oh, it's another one of you, and instead it makes you go, why am I fighting this guy so soon? That's so stupid. And it's like they ran out of ideas as to what to put for the combat sequences, so they just instead opted to reuse that split head boss fight just to give you a reason to drain your ammunition, just to go back to the store and just buy all your ammunition again. And you know the thing I really dislike about the store? You don't have the ability to select how much you want when it comes to ammunition or anything else. Like, there's no quantity system. You have to pretty much press X on the icon in order to watch an animation of an item being built inside of this 3D printer, and he picks it up, and then you have to press X again, and then you have to repeat the process. Why the hell do you not put in a quantity system where you press like left or right on the D-pad in order to say, for instance, want like 250 of this ammunition, or like 10 of these bullets, or like something like that, like similar to Resident Evil Village, where you press left on the D-pad to go from 0 to like 250, and like 250 was like the maximum amount you could get in terms of handgun ammo in like Mercenaries mode, I believe. So like, you immediately go to the max quantity by selecting left or right on the D-pad, and you don't have to watch any kind of stupid animation. But they force you to watch those animations of the items being built that it just becomes so tedious. And there are so many moments in this part of the walkthrough where I've just sped through those moments. I've increased them to like 8 times speed just to get by them, because what on earth would I be talking about? I'm just watching an animation playing, and this is not a good way to make the player appreciate your animations. Like, give us the ability to select the maximum quantity allowed, and then have us watch that same animation only once. That way we can actually appreciate the animation and not get fed up with it, with how much it's going to be repeated. It's that simple. I don't understand why they designed it this way. And, you know, Dead Space 1, 2, and 3, I mean, they didn't have this kind of max quantity system, but at least when you're mashing X to select your ammunition in the store, It's fast, and you're not having to watch any animation in order to get all that ammunition. You're just mashing X, and like the text box is appearing and disappearing like very fast. That's how it should be. I don't want to sit through an animation just to actually hate it after a while. Like, this is something that at least Last of Us Part 2 understood when they were designing those animations where you're upgrading your weapons, because you only see those animations once when you upgrade your weapons. It's a one-time thing. You can appreciate the beauty of these animations. You can appreciate the hard work that went into it. But when they're literally forcing you to rewatch these animations in such a short time frame, it's really annoying. But enough of that little rant. Let's just talk about the sequence. So you're just going to be following this wire all the way to the breaker system, and there are going to be a couple more of these blind enemies. And once again, doing stealth kills, you have free reign to deal with them because you don't make any noise when you do stealth kills. That's how it should be. It might look very weird, but in the context of a game, this is how it should be because the game is going to get very bullshit in the later chapters, and you're going to need as much ammunition and as much money as possible if you're going to do the rest of this game. And this is just the game's way of allowing you to use stealth in a way that makes sense, to actually indulge in the game systems, and I like that, even if these sequences go on a little too long. That is my main criticism of all these sequences involving the blind enemies. They make the sequences way too long, and I don't think they offer a lot in the intermediary period between combat encounters to spice up the gameplay, so that you forget that you did this very lengthy encounter. That's my main gripe with this. It gets very repetitive and tedious real soon, and without any sort of varying degrees of gameplay, it really leaves a sour taste in your mouth when you're just recollecting these moments. And I think this is as good a time as any to talk about the environments in this game. I think the environments on this game are shit. They really are. I feel like they end up feeling like copy-pasted environments. They don't feel like they have a lot of variety to the environments, and it just feels like the mechanized sci-fi atmosphere really wears thin with how much the areas look so identical to each other, and there isn't really any standout environments. Like, they don't feel so unique from one another. The only time this is ever the case is at the end of the game when you're in that executive forum, because the way the floor and the walls look and just the lighting, it looks so different to every other environment you've been in. And considering this game is made by the same developers who designed Dead Space 2, and Dead Space 2 has more varied environments, more memorable locations than this game, how can that be? I don't understand how they could do so poorly with the environments, and Ether feels the same way, but there is a slight difference. He says the environments are mainly underutilized, and I do agree with him on that. The environments are largely underutilized in this game, and they don't feel memorable in the slightest, and like I said, they feel copy and paste. A lot of the sequences can be very tedious, and there isn't really a flavor to them. There isn't any kind of unique flavor to the environments that allows them to feel memorable compared to Dead Space 2, and I think it's a massive shame. I mean, this game, at times it can look very nice, but at times, I feel like it can look just as nice as Black Ops 3. I feel like this game can have the same graphics quality as Black Ops 3. That's my personal opinion of it. And without a very interesting environment for this game's graphical engine to stand out, the graphics just don't feel that impressive overall. I mean, you can make a game pretty, but when you don't have the environments to complement the graphical fidelity of your game, you just don't have a very interesting world to stare at. And like, that's why as much as Assassin's Creed Unity can be praised for having a very interesting environment to stare at when it comes to the graphics, overall, it's just very boring because so many of the buildings feel copy and paste. Like, the coloration is so bleak, and there's no sense of variety to the colors. Like, the only time Paris ever looks nice in Assassin's Creed Unity is when you're doing the rift sequences. Like, for instance, when you go further into the future, in that one rift sequence, not in the World War II era, more so, I think it's the 1800s, I believe, that you go, and like there's like lanterns, there's some really nice coloration there. Like, it looks really nice, and I can appreciate the graphics of Assassin's Creed Unity even more. But overall, Assassin's Creed Unity looks like a pile of dog shit, if you ask me. Because what good is a graphics engine without colorful environments and anything to stand out? Like, there's no palette to that game. And similarly, the Callisto Protocol doesn't have much of a palette to go on when it comes to the way it's designed its environments. And a lot of the environments just feel bleak. Like the same coloration, just dirty and just black and like that's really it. It's like the older Call of Duty games with their sense of brown to them. That's really all I have to say about that particular tangent. But right now, we're doing the sequence with the 3 breakers. This is very easy, and when you activate all 3 of the breakers, the enemies will die. Or maybe they don't die, they actually just run off somewhere else, I believe. Because you don't really get the chance to loot their bodies once you activate all 3 of the breakers. But you're just going to be stealth killing the enemies and just remaining crouched at all times. The blind enemies on this game aren't as sensitive to sound as the clickers were in The Last of Us Part 2 and the remake when you're playing on grounded difficulty. So you don't have to lightly brush the analog stick, which is really nice. I hate those kind of games where you have to lightly brush the analog stick while you're crouched in order to not make as much noise. It really doesn't feel right on the analog stick to do that. But this game at least allows you to avoid that, and you can move at your max speed while crouching and not incur the wrath of these enemies, which is really well designed. And I gotta say, that's one of the things I can appreciate about Striking Distance Studios when they design these enemies. But now that we've done all of that, we've made our way back to the platform, and you're gonna need a lot of riot gun ammo to deal with the split head boss fight coming up, and you'll want a lot of batteries for this sequence. And this sequence is better designed than Dead Space 2's drill sequence. I feel like the drill sequence from Dead Space 2, the enemy patterns and the way the enemies spawn onto the drill can be overwhelming and pretty bullshit at times. I don't feel like the combat of Dead Space 2 is built for that kind of RNG fest. But here, they've made it better designed by designing the combat encounter to complement the game system. So how this is going to work is there are going to be 4 enemies on either side of this drill, and only one side will be favored until you kill off all 4 of the enemies on this side, and then the next 4 enemies will spawn from another side to this drill. And primarily when you restart the checkpoint, the enemies will first spawn from this side of the arena, and then they will spawn behind you. Then they'll spawn on the other side, like that, the side that is perpendicular to this backside right over here, and then they will spawn near the terminal. That is how the pattern works for this sequence. And I feel like it complements the combat and the pacing of the combat especially, like, and it complements the mechanics. I feel like it gels better with the mechanics of the combat compared to what it would be like if this sequence was designed similarly to Dead Space 2's drill sequence. Oh, and also right there, this is very important. When you are using the riot gun on these enemies, wait until the enemies start to transform and then use the riot gun. Because if you use the riot gun to dismember their legs before they've started their mutation process, they will just immediately attack you when they're on the ground. It's very bullshit. So when they're mutating and you dismember their legs, they will not have the ability to attack you because they're still mutating. So by doing that, you are able to deal with these enemies in another way, and this is really where the riot gun showcases how amazing of a weapon it is. It's completely useless and pretty underpowered against the basic enemies, even if it does generate a lot of knockback. But against the blind enemies, because the blind enemies have more fragile limbs, the riot gun is a guaranteed dismemberment on their legs. Aside from the moments where they go into attack animations and they just ignore the dismemberment, that's really where the clunkiness in the dismemberment system really shows itself when you're trying to use the riot gun against these blind enemies. And now we have this. This right here is a very boring, dragged out fight. And who in their right mind thought it was a good idea to introduce 4 of these split head enemies, and they're not even spaced out long enough for you to not realize that they're overusing this enemy way too much. I mean, I can't tell you how pissed off I was that I had to fight this enemy 2, 3, 4 times. I was so done with the game at that point when I had to fight this enemy for the 3rd time. And like the second encounter with the split head boss fight is even worse because they introduce one basic enemy alongside this guy. But as long as you're prioritizing that one basic enemy, it's fine, because that one basic enemy will die instantly from the riot gun. but that added pressure leads to the split head easily hitting you, and you have to keep your distance from this guy at all times. I mean, you can dodge all of his attacks, but given that it's just going to increase the time you're spent in this dragged out, miserable fight, you're far better off just keeping your distance and just shooting this guy with the riot gun. You can also use the upgraded hand cannon as well. Like, Ether did an upgraded hand cannon only run of this game, and it worked pretty well. And I've never upgraded my weapons in this game. I mean, I've upgraded the riot gun fully, but I've only used it for a bit, so I'm not able to give the best assessment of how effective the fully upgraded riot gun is. But this is all I'm doing, guys. Is this engaging? Like, this is stuff from, like, 1998 or something. Like, from the 1990s. This is the kind of boss design this game is favoring? Are you fucking serious? And to be honest, though, Visceral Games doesn't really deliver the best in terms of boss content. The boss fights in Dead Space were always very bad. They were never very interesting. Some of them could be bullshit. Some of them could be way too simple. This falls in line with the latter category. And it's way too simple, it's way too boring, and this guy should not have this much life. All that does is just show how dull that entire fight is. And the split head boss fight doesn't make any sense in this department. It takes so few bullets to put him on his knees in order to bisect him the first time, but then it takes even more bullets to fully finish him off. Why is it not 50-50 in the percentages? Like the amount of shots it takes to fully bisect this guy and then he tears off his head, that should be the same amount of shots it takes to fully kill him after he's bisected himself. Why is it not 50-50 like that? I don't understand. It doesn't make any fucking sense. How he could have even more life in the second phase compared to the first phase. It should be 50-50. I mean, it's so fucking stupid. I mean, I don't know what the fuck they were thinking with the split-head boss fight, but it just goes to show that this game, as much as Glenn Schofield can hype this game up, this game is definitely a 3 out of 10 in terms of its quality, and the split-head boss fight just adds more to the reduction of that score. It's really fucking stupid. And right now, we're inside this colony area. This right here is a great example of an underutilized, unfinished area. This area held a bit of promise. I mean, I really thought I was going to immerse myself with the history of the miners, but I don't get the chance to do that whatsoever. You spend so little time in this colony area, and all you're doing is just a handful of encounters with a bunch of enemies, and you're not learning any lore, and the lore files that they give you when you actually tear off the cores from the dead bodies, it's just a bunch of people exclaiming stuff. They're not talking about lore, they're just talking about their, like, thoughts on whatever they're doing. They're just voicing complaints, they're panicking. Like, there's nothing that relates to the lore of the actual story involving the biophage pathogen. None of the lore files in this game are worth going for. How could they fucking do that? At least there are some lore files worth going for in Dead Space 1, 2, and 3 when understanding the lore. I mean, as I've already mentioned in my blind playthrough, that one lore file involving that one soldier who was with those other soldiers, and they were stuck inside of that building during the winter storm, and some of the soldiers decided to eat the flesh of the necromorphs that they killed because they had to eat something to survive, and they were running low on supplies, and then in the process they turned in those feeders, and it really sounded very intimidating. Like, it was so fun to understand that lore aspect. It was so fun to actually get some intimidating audio log like that, but none of the audio logs are like that whatsoever. It's so fucking bad. How could they mess up so much on the story on this game? And then the main story points that they deliver with this game feels so much like a rehashing of concepts from Dead Space and Resident Evil. It spends more time using the nostalgia aspects of just reminding you how great Dead Space and Resident Evil were, that it doesn't have anything to stand on. It doesn't have any two legs to stand on whatsoever. The story is so cookie-cutter and so heavily reused from other games. Oh, the miners discovered this alien life form underneath the planet, and this mirrors the miners on Aegis 7 and Dead Space 1 finding the marker. And then you have this stuff on human evolution, and oh, this one subject was able to somehow adapt to the biophage pathogen well, that it allowed him to maintain his strength and his intellectual capacities to not become like the other infected individuals. It mirrors Oswald E. Spencer's plans on his idea of human evolution. Oh, and the virus leaked out in Resident Evil 1. Well, the biophage pathogen leaked out as well during one of the first initial outbreaks. I mean, do you see what I mean? Do you see how much this game spends just reminding you of those story beats from Dead Space and Resident Evil? It's so fucking retarded. It's really retarded. Like, they just did not know what they were doing with this game at all. And this is further confirmed by the revelation at the end of the game when Warden Cole is just talking with a bunch of alien life forms that look like those Skrulls from the MCU. What the fuck was the whole point of that? We were going through this entire game, not once thinking about the idea of some kind of alien race, and they're just introduced out of the blue at the end of the game, most likely to set up for some kind of sequel that this game will most likely not get. And if it does, that's going to be very shocking. Although, this game is getting story DLC, apparently. So, I'll probably be playing the story DLC and doing a walkthrough of that, but I don't think it's going to hold a candle to other story DLCs I've played in other games. Like, they pulled the alien card out of nowhere because they knew they had nothing to go on, nothing to fall back on with actually getting the story back into top shape. They just didn't. And like I said, they didn't know what the hell they were doing. It's almost like 4 different writers handled this game, and they had conflicting thoughts as to how the story should go for this game. But I'm gonna have to pause on this tangent right here because look at this. We're fighting a split head so soon after the fucking split head boss fight from the fucking drill. And we have barely explored this colony. We might as well have gone through 2 different rooms, pretty much. Actually 3. Just 3 different floors. And they don't have anything expansive to them. This is the last part of the colony right here. Are you fucking kidding me? And after this split-head boss fight, we do a whole moment where we drop down back to the bottom level, kill a bunch of insignificant enemies, and then regroup with Danny. Like, why did they need to include that? They weren't trying to introduce any kind of interesting story beat. They just have Jacob fall down and go back up towards Danny. Nothing important happened. Why did they put it there? I don't fucking understand. How much this game can feel creatively bankrupt at times? If they're going to be reusing this split-head boss fight over and over again, or just reuse stuff from other games, or just have sequences play out that don't contribute in any way to the story, or have cores that you can loot that don't contribute to the story whatsoever. It's so fucking lame. This is so throwaway right now. I mean, it really feels like creative bankruptcy, I'm telling you guys. I mean, not really as creatively bankrupt as what Ubisoft did with Assassin's Creed. But for a single game, for a new IP made by Striking Distance Studios, some kind of continuation of Visceral Games' vision of survival horror, this is fucking lame. This is lackluster. This is abysmal. But you wanna know the only thing that's redeemable about this game? It's better than Shadows of Rose. It's miles better than the Shadows of Rose DLC from Resident Evil Village. Easily the worst Resident Evil DLC I have ever played. And how dare they consider that DLC to be status gold, like ready to be released to the market, when they had no vision for a story, they had no vision for the environments, they just reused all sorts of environments from the main experience. Like, the entire DLC is just reused assets. It might as well just be some extra game mode, not a story DLC. Rose as a character is pathetic. They ruined Ethan Winters as a character even more in the Shadows of Rose DLC. They brought back Evelyn for no reason. She has no contribution to the story whatsoever. The lore points that they bring with the Shadows of Rose DLC are so insignificant and unnecessary and only serve to further confuse exactly how the Megamycete and the Mutamycete work from this village area. Like, I have never played anything so rushed, so lazy, so uninspired, so insulting, so offensive as a piece of content than with the Shadows of Rose DLC. And I could hate on the Executioner DLC from The Evil Within, but at least it felt more like an extra game mode than some kind of additional story content, because every single story beat they introduced in the Executioner DLC wasn't followed up properly in The Evil Within 2. So I can at least forgive them for that aspect with the Executioner DLC, even though it is a very piss-poor DLC for The Evil Within. but my god, Shadows of Rose doesn't deserve to exist right now. They established Rose properly in the ending of Resident Evil Village. I mean, not really properly, more so like inoffensive compared to that DLC. Why did they have to make that DLC? It was so unnecessary, and they made it a paid DLC when the fucking Not a Hero DLC from Resident Evil 7 was a free piece of content, and everything in it was new! Talk about a fucking ripoff with the Shadows of Rose DLC. I will gladly play the Callisto Protocol any day over that piece of shit content known as the Shadows of Rose DLC. It has no right to exist, and it only serves to put Resident Evil in a direction it was never meant to go, and if new Capcom listens to their idiotic fan base, the people who are actually praising this piss-poor DLC, Resident Evil is going to be in a very bad place. That's all I have to say about that. That is just awful. But we're not fighting Captain Ferris. The guy is just roided out. He's all, like, ripped. He has, like, muscles all over the place. Does this really look like something befitting for a survival horror game? Especially compared to the other enemies we've encountered? Like, this guy feels so out of character with the world of the Callisto Protocol. And furthermore, his fight is very broken because there are moments where, for some reason, the dodge system can just choose not to register, and he will get a free hit out on you. And this was happening so many times, at least before patch 1.08, but I'm positive it's still an issue. I mean, in a lot of the fights I did against him in patch 1.08, I wasn't getting any issues. So they might have fixed it, but I don't trust it. And Ether had mentioned that these issues where the dodge system doesn't work against Captain Ferris randomly out of the blue is tied to the performance mode, and that you need to have performance mode off in order for this issue to not be the case. But before the patch released, I was fighting Captain Ferris without the performance mode, and I was still getting issues where the dodge wouldn't register properly, even though they said there's no timing window, you just hold left or right on the analog stick and he'll dodge. Yet how the fuck does that fail against Captain Ferris? That makes no sense. I just hope they fix this issue with Captain Ferris, because if they haven't, how the fuck did they QA test this fight and consider it serviceable for the fucking public? I really don't understand. But that is the end of this part of the walkthrough. Stay tuned for the final part. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.